Welcome to Right Now Workshop Podcast, where you can write a book and change the world. I'm your host, Kitty Bucholtz, and this is episode 80, Crafting a Novel Around a Real Person, an interview with Sydney Avey, coming to you on Thursday, June 21st, 2018. Now, we've probably all read at least one novel that has a real-life character in the background. So whether it's a king or a president or a famous artist or who knows what, you can have real people in your books, but most people put those real people in the background so that they don't have to worry about what the actual things that happened on certain dates and whether or not it was really done a certain way. They just want to have some flavor and some interesting bits to their setting that will make the book seem even more interesting to readers who like that time period. Now, Sydney has actually taken some relatives of hers who had super interesting stories, and she was trying to figure out how to tell their story as the main character, even though they're a real person, but she doesn't know everything about them. And so she ended up writing a book called The Trials of Nellie Belle, and it is a really interesting exploration of how you can take a real life and fill it in with a lot of interesting fictional details that come from the conjecture of, well, if this, then probably that, and see how a novel gets born. So this is a really interesting interview coming at writing a novel from a different direction, one that I haven't explored before. I hope that you enjoy it, and if you are writing fiction or nonfiction, I think that either way, you're going to find some interesting things that Sydney has to say that you may be able to apply to the real life characters that you're writing about. So I hope you enjoy it. Here's the interview. Today's guest is Sydney Avey. Sydney is the author of 3 historical fiction novels, The Sheepwalker's Daughter, The Lyre and the Lambs, and The Trials of Nellie Belle. Her poetry has appeared in anthologies such as Forge Journal and Out of the Fire, and her short stories in magazines such as Blue Guitar, TWJ, and Foliate Oak. She lives with her husband and a cat named Clyde in the Sierra foothills near Yosemite, California, and the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. Welcome, Sydney.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I'm excited to have you here. This is going to be something new and different that I haven't actually spoken to another writer personally, and certainly we haven't talked about the sorts of things that you and I will be talking about here on the podcast before, so I'm super excited.
I am too.
Well, let's give listeners a little bit of background about you. I was on your website today, and I noticed that you have writing credits dating back to the 1990s. So tell us a little bit about how you got started.
I believe I was born with a pen in my hand. And my great-grandmother, Nellie Belle, is the one who, as far as I know, got that started. And so it's just in the genes. I was always the newsletter queen for whatever activity was going on. And so that's why those credits are there. If I were on the job or in a volunteer agency and something needed to be written, that would be me. And so some of that work made its way into publication, such as through my church, I did an interview for their newsletter and also a chaplain's newsletter. I went to jail. That's fun. What do people know about you that what do we not know about you? I've been to jail. Well, no, it was to do an interview in the juvenile facility in San Jose, and to talk about what the chaplains do with. Then that was years and years ago. So that's just how all of that evolved kind of naturally.
Wow. All right. So then articles and shorter works eventually led to a novel. So how did that happen?
I always wanted to do creative writing. I also wanted a career so that I could help support the family. And I wanted to use my writing in my career. And that didn't always lead to creative types writing. I had a 20-year career with Hewlett-Packard in marketing communications.
Wow.
So anytime I got a chance to volunteer to be the one to tell the United Way stories, for the employees, I would do that. And I was able to use creativity. They were wonderful about allowing me to do that. But when I had the opportunity to retire, I thought, now I want to do what I love. I want to do creative writing. So I got kind of a late start in that. I also had to unlearn the news style writing that an article,
Right.
that you use in an article. And so I'm actually writing my 4th novel now. I'm working on it, and that's the one I wanted to do first. But when I started, that was about 10 years ago, I started writing novels. When I started, I thought, I really don't know how to do this. So I need to start with something a little simpler. And that's when I started joining writers groups and going to writers conferences. And I can't say enough about doing that kind of prep work and realizing that you're going to grow as a writer. And so you have to jump in and make mistakes. And one of the things I've enjoyed so much, the Sheepwalker's Daughter was very well received. People who are reading the Trials of Nellie Belle, we love the Sheepwalker's Daughter. We love Nellie. It's really, your writing's getting better. And I said, that's the kindest, nicest thing you could say to me. Because if it's not getting better, then that's very discouraging. So long answer to your question. I can't even remember what the question was.
Just how you got involved moving your way from articles to short stories.
From articles to short stories. It was to be creative and use more of my imagination. Articles are they're news, they're facts.
Yeah.
Short stories, you're using the images that are in your head, and that is a whole different level. I think you can probably bring that into articles. Really good writers do, but it's a different way of thinking. Then when I retired, I'd always wanted, I think, to write a novel, but it requires a lifestyle change.
Yeah.
And so when I decided I thought, it's now or never. We're not going to get any younger here. Either you're going to do this, or you're going to just say, I'm not going to do this, let it go. So I negotiated it with my husband, and I said, this is what I want to do, but it means I'm going to have to give up lots of things, which means you're going to have to give up lots of things. Like, I'm not making your lunch anymore. I'm not even making dinner. And so he was fully supportive. And I had to get really comfortable with letting go of things that had just been a natural, gardening and sewing, and I loved all of it. But writing takes such focus, and so it's a journey, and it was very, very exciting to do that, and also wonderful to have my husband's support. And
that is wonderful. Wow.
So that's kind of the trajectory.
Excellent. So the Trials of Nellie Belle is your 3rd novel that you published?
3rd published novel, yes.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about, you kind of mentioned it earlier, I think. Who is Nellie Belle, and how did you get this idea?
Okay. Nellie Belle was my great-grandmother. I never met her, but I sure heard a lot about her.
Really?
She was the black sheep of my family, because she left a husband and children in the early progressive era when that was not done, and she wanted a career. Well, now let me back up. The facts are, she went to work and she had a career, and so eventually she ended up. There was this household that my mother grew up in, with my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my mother's half-sister. And the dynamic was that we had these 2 women in this household who were very talented, very ambitious, larger-than-life personalities. And then we had my grandmother, who also was very talented but was very quiet. And then my mother, who was just overwhelmed by all of this. And so I grew up knowing that my mom had been deeply affected by this experience. But still, when she would talk to me every once in a while, she'd be talking to me about some characteristics that I had, and she'd go, "You're you're just like her. You're just like Nellie Belle." And I thought, I'm not sure you mean that as a compliment, but it sure does make me curious, to know that. So my mother gave me my great Nellie Belle's creative writing stories. When Nellie Belle finished her career as a court reporter, she took a creative writing class, and she wrote fabulous stories. Now, I didn't read them right away. I was raising children when I was given this. I didn't read them until after I retired. And then I read them and I thought, these are incredible. They were so funny. They were so poignant. There was this voice of this woman, and she was my great-grandmother. And I thought, I need to know more. I couldn't tell whether the stories were actually true, but they definitely reflect the early progressive era where women were starting to go to work and they were starting to fight for social justice. And all of that was in those stories. And the values of trying to balance what they wanted with also being good wives and mothers, and trying to maintain that was all there. So I thought about, okay, I should just edit these and see if I can get them published. But it still didn't answer the question of who really was Nellie Belle. What really happened in her life? Why did she leave her husband? Why did she feel that was necessary to do? So I decided that I would weave the stories into a story of her life. Now, how do you tell a story of somebody's life when they're not a famous person and there's not a lot, that you can go on, and the people in your family won't talk about her, who actually knew her, won't say very much about her. I just had to think back about what had been said and think about motivations. And the more I worked with it, the clearer picture I got of who she was.
Wow.
So that's the background and then of course it turned into a generational story, and it focuses on Nellie Belle. There is quite a bit about the granddaughter that was my mother's sister. Those two had a bond, so I tell Leone's story as well. And then the relationships and the things that I found interesting. My own grandmother, Opal, Nellie Belle's daughter, went to New York when she was 16 years old and danced vaudeville. That's interesting. Interesting. She wasn't famous, but she had those experiences. She came home with a baby, but not a husband. Yeah. And the stories I got and the stories I was able to, the story I was able to confirm with what little, we have such research now with genealogy. Now you can get dates and you say, oh, it didn't really quite happen that way. I can tell by the dates and where people were that's the family story. That isn't really the way it happened. So to put those things together, it's the stuff of a novel. The biggest challenge was how to weave that story.
Yeah. Wow. This is really interesting. I just never heard of anybody, taking some true life people and then trying to make them, because we think in novels that's fiction, so it's not true. But you're just kind of it sounds like you're filling in the gaps.
Exactly. That's exactly. And that was difficult. First of all, I will say that because I had a decision to make, was I going to use their real names?
Right.
And I also had was I going to use their real names? And I decided that I would use real names for people who are no longer living. Because legally you can do that. But if they're living, they can sue you.
Yeah.
I didn't have anybody living that was going to do that. You also can make the decision as to whether you're going to, I wanted to tell the truth. I was not going to not tell the truth. But I also wanted to be compassionate.
Yeah.
I was very impressed by the way Jeanette Walls handled her novel, The Glass Castle. She could have trashed her family. She did not do that. She treated them with love and compassion, and it was such a much better story. It wasn't a tell-all. It was more a look at the human heart and in recognition that we all have difficulties. And the realization, too, that there's two sides to every story, and they're both true. And so how you deal, and if you deal with that compassionately, you can show a person's failings without trashing them. So that was the way I went into the book. I also decided I do have relatives that knew her and knew some of the people that were in the book that are no longer alive. And I care very much about those people. So I thought, I'm going to get their permission to do this. If they don't want to give their permission, I may write the book, but I won't publish it. Right. So when I got it in the first draft, I went and spent time with them, with my cousins. And I spent a whole day telling the story as I knew it and saying, is there anything that you know that I'm getting wrong? Or anything that you know? Well, it turned out I knew a whole lot more because of research than they actually did. But they could confirm that pretty much I was getting this the way it was. And they had gaps also. And so then I said, okay, I'm saying some things that you might not want said. They said, publish it.
Oh.
I just, that is a decision I think writers have to make. And I valued peace in the family more than I valued publishing a book. That's an individual decision that people have to make. So then once I felt like I had that permission, and then when I'm going back through all the drafts and all the editing, and still wrestling with the fact that some of it is hearsay, what you hear around the table. That becomes part of the story. Could I actually confirm where exactly she worked and what the exact dates were? No, I couldn't. Right. But the story definitely, it rings true. It's true to the era. And I just have to put all the clues together to make the best story that I can. In the process, I feel like I tell people, I put Nellie Belle on the literary stage and I made her explain herself. And she did a brilliant job of it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love the way you say that. That's really cool. Wow. Okay, so this sounds like a lot more work than if you just made up a story out of your head that you just, had a dream and Yes. So tell us a little bit, particularly for listeners who have an interesting relative that they've been trying to figure out, if I could write their story, how would I do it? Or how would I figure out where to begin? Or give us a little bit of like the things that you researched, the things that you learned about, but threw out because, like you said, that fact wasn't actually going to work well in the story, but the story would have the ring of truth in it. Tell us about that.
Okay. I highly first of all, I highly recommend a timeline. You're going to have to keep track of all of this, of what happened when, and some things like Nellie Belle's stories, I didn't have dates on them. She didn't date her work as to exactly when this happened. So I had leeway to move those stories around to fit the period of time. But that all, it's like doing a puzzle. You fit the pieces together and then something doesn't fit. And so you have to take a section apart. Yeah. Of course, you're going to keep those pieces. You're not going to throw them away. You're going to set them aside, look and see what fits better. And then it's magic. This little piece over here that needs to go in that story, it needs to go somewhere. Oh, it's going to work here. It's going to make the story better if we put it over here. So it's structuring a story like that, I think, is the biggest challenge, which is why I hired Marcy to help me do that. One of the reviews says that my story is like a patchwork quilt, that when you put it all together, it tells a story. Now, some people love patchwork quilts and others don't. So I do get, that the time frames, because it does it jumps, it's got parallel stories, and it's going back and forth in time. And I try as best I can to signal that. But that's not for every reader's taste. But this is the way this story wanted to be told, because it involved relationships that develop over time. You get to know people over time, so you get to know characters over time. And we're looking at Nellie Belle through the eyes of her daughter, who has one personality, through the eyes of her granddaughter, who has another personality, and then through the eyes of her co-workers, who, what I heard from my grandmother was that she was highly respected in the legal community, because she despite the divorce, she maintained a sense of propriety, and she had boundaries, but she was very witty and very intelligent. And so they loved hearing her, they loved having her in their midst, so that they could tell stories and be appreciated, and so that she could tell her stories. That's the picture that I got from what little was said in the home about her.
Wow.
Also, other clues. I think too, when you're writing this kind of a novel, what are the clues to the story? One of the clues was that she remained friends with her ex-husband. He remarried, and she thought kindly of his new wife, which gave me a clue about her character and how desperate she must have been to get out of this situation, but it wasn't to be able to be free to use the intelligence that she had. But I don't know what actually caused the divorce. That's conjecture. Right. So you need to get comfortable as a storyteller with what makes sense for the story. I'm seeing more and more of this. I'm seeing more kind of disclaimers in people's books, that they've done the best with the facts that they have, but that there are things in there that are true to the times, true to the spirit, but not necessarily actually happened. I'm seeing more of this. It makes for a better story, but you want to be as true as you possibly can.
Right. I like the way that you said that you can look at the bits that you have and then think, logically and out of the sense of intelligence that we have about human nature, psychology, everything else. Okay, a person who does this, gets divorced, but does this, is still friends with her husband and is, has a kindness to his new wife. What kind of a person is that? And therefore, what kind of other decisions might she make, and what other?
Yes, absolutely. I was fortunate in that most of her stories were about court cases, or about things she would have experienced on the job, keeping in mind that it's not like it is on TV today. Court isn't like in those days, where she was an itinerant court reporter who traveled the circuit, and she would go into a small town where maybe they would use an empty building for court, and court would be one day a year. And so it was a day when justice was swift and judgments were common sense. And so that allowed for all kinds of personalities and foibles, and that's what showed up in her stories, are all those personalities and those judgments that are made on common sense, and not so much by some kind of a formula that we have today.
Right.
And so now that was kind of a rabbit hole. Where was I going with that? One of the stories did talk about her and her childhood and an incident that I am going to take as factual, where a book was lost and she was charged with finding it, or though actually all the kids, keep an eye out for this book, and returning it to the owner. And you have to read the book to get the whole story on this, but he was a rich man from the East who came out and to visit her, and a rich young man. She was a young girl, but not that young. And so there was the potential. She had high hopes that this would go somewhere, and it didn't. It went in a different direction. And I thought, she's got to be talking about something real that happened in her life, because so I used that as a basis for some of the decisions that she made. Also, all books need a little bit of romance, don't they?
That's right. Everybody's life has some kind of love story in it.
It does. It does. It does.
Oh, wow. Okay, so again, thinking about what listeners might be asking themselves right now. So some of the things that you looked to for research was, it just so happened that you had actual writings by your great-grandma.
Yes, original source material. And then you also spoke to your relatives, whoever would be willing to talk about her, and tried to see stories that they might have that were different or the same as yours. Mm-hmm. I also had, I'm holding this up for people who see an old scrapbook. And in this scrapbook are newspaper articles. And now it belongs to Leon, but I discovered, for example, that Nellie Belle belonged to the, what was it? The Court Reporters Society or something. And just going through this gave me a lot of clues as to what was meaningful in their lives. So,
wow.
Scrapbooks and photographs.
So anybody who's watching on YouTube, this is a scrapbook that Nellie Belle's granddaughter was putting together when they were all living together?
Yes.
Wow.
And so this gave me a lot of information as to what they might be thinking and what was important to them.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay, that is really interesting. And then, so it sounded like you also might have done some genealogy research.
Yes. Putting together a family tree on ancestry.com. I'll give them a little plug. I put together a family timeline so that I could that helped me understand what was happening when. I discovered from that family from that timeline that Nellie Belle's husband, John, had 10 brothers.
Wow.
And that family came from Canada. And as I looked to see what happened to those brothers, they ended up they ended up on the West Coast. You look at the time frame, well, that's when the economy was tanking in the Midwest, which is where they all came from, but it was starting to boom. They had discovered oil, and the economy was starting to boom in California. That gave me an opportunity to say, that's how she must have ended up on the West Coast. Some of those brothers were there in Los Angeles. I'll bet you that they said, hey, there's work out here. And so then she would have talked him into going there, because as it turns out, her younger sister had relocated in Spokane. I didn't know any of this until I did that ancestry.com relationships. And then just by putting people, they were here then, then I could draw a kind of a story arc, or draw a map. I could map where she might have been. At the same time, I remembered hearing a lot in my family about the Chicago World Fair. I heard my great-grandmother, or my grandmother, Opal, told lots of stories about what a wonderful fair that was. So then when I looked at the time frame, I thought, there's every reason to believe that Nellie Belle actually was there. Wow. And that's where those stories came from. And So I did a lot of research. That led to a lot of research on the World Fair. And but you do massive research, and then you pick just one or two little details. What would have attracted her? And then, so in the book, there is one scene in which John is showing her, they're still married at the time, he's showing her this wonderful new invention, the washing machine, the dishwasher. Wonderful. We'll have to get us one of those. And meanwhile, here's the inventor standing there, who's a woman. And Nellie is thinking, I'm more interested in how that woman did that and became CEO of this company that manufactures dishwashers, and that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So getting to know your character helps a lot with developing the story. Everything is so big, you have to give the readers context. And if you can narrow it down on just a few details that reveal what it is your character values, what it is your character cares about, that all contributes to an exciting story, I think.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So we talked a little bit before we started recording, but again, just for people who are listening and trying to decide how should I handle this, let's look at the question of, do I write about this from a nonfiction standpoint or a fiction standpoint? What do you think are some questions people can be asking themselves when they're trying to decide which direction they should go?
Well, I think it's important to think about who you want to read this. If you're writing for your family and you want to document what happened, and that's a wonderful thing to do, then absolutely go nonfiction. Just tell what you know and what you've learned through research. Nonfiction works very well for that. Mm-hmm. If you have enough information and there's enough interest in your character because of something, I mean, Nellie Belle's claim to fame was reputedly the first female court reporter on the West Coast. Now that's interesting to most people that I've talked to, but she wasn't a federal judge, with all kinds of news written about her. So I think that's going to play into also. And then, what kind of writing do you like to do? If you don't want to publish and if you're not interested in publishing, I think there are a lot of people who love to write and really are not interested in publishing. Then whatever kind of writing you enjoy. If you enjoy nonfiction, write it nonfiction. If you enjoy creativity, do that. If you're going,
in which case you could take one or more relatives and just write all sorts of little short stories about snippets of stories that you've heard, maybe.
Yes, absolutely, you could do that. Absolutely. I will confess that Nellie does show up in my first book, The Sheepwalker's Daughter, as a fictionalized character. If I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have done that, because people will say, "Is that the same person?" Well, no, not really, but real person. This is just somebody I modeled after her. So definitely you can use them as models. And what's interesting about that is you get to know them better when you do that. I started out The Sheepwalker's Daughter. Most of my books start out with a question. The question for The Sheepwalker's Daughter was, why do families keep secrets? And my family had, there'd been some secrets kept, and I wasn't particularly happy about it, and I wondered why they felt it necessary. When I finished writing the book, I understood why. And I understood, I grew, and I learned that, people have the right to do that if that's the decision they want to make. It's good if they understand what some of the consequences of those decisions are, which are trust issues and shock when it all comes out. Or what was the big deal? Why did you hide that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yes, I keep losing my little earbud here.
That's okay.
you make the decisions based on what kind of writing that you like to do and who you're writing for.
Yeah.
And what your purpose in writing is. My purpose, there's personal ones and then ones that I have as a writer. My purpose was really I thought, what better thing could I do than to get her work published?
Yeah.
I wanted to get to know her. And that's my way of processing. Other people could do it through a painting. There's all kinds of art forms where you can use the themes, the characteristics, and produce art. One of the values of fictionalizing, I think, is that you can really work with the characteristics, and it's the show don't tell.
Right.
And you can work creatively with characteristics that have come down through generations. And you can look at what did I inherit that serves me well?
Yeah.
And what have I inherited? What little seeds do I have in my soul that were sown generations ago that maybe don't serve me so well?
Yeah.
And so, and you can encourage others in your writing to do the same things. I've had many people say, this made me want to find out more about the people who came before me. And the value of doing that is that then you find out more about yourself.
Yeah.
And then say you realize, as I did, that writing has been in the blood for generations. It's going to be very encouraging to say, you sort of got a leg up there. You've got some writing genes, go ahead and go for it. But maybe there are other characteristics. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's low self-esteem. Maybe it's selfishness that you can see didn't play out so well, and you have it in yourself, and you can identify it and wrestle with it and work with it. And so creative writing, and we're talking here literary fiction and historical fiction. If it's genre fiction, romance and mystery, I think that's a different animal, because there are some formulas that you need to follow to produce a book. Literary fiction and historical fiction, I give you a little bit more leeway in, I don't want to say developing characters, because there are wonderful characters that are obviously wonderful characters, but it's a different process, I think.
Right. Like in genre fiction, there are certain signposts that you're going to need to hit. Mm-hmm. If it's romance, then there needs to be some sort of happy ending. If it's mystery, we need to know who done it at the end.
Exactly.
But in literary fiction, you may never find out why something happened or who did it, or
yes, and it's not always a happy ending, and that's difficult for those of us who are writing literary fiction, historical fiction, and really wanting to go into the truth of something. It isn't always a happy ending, but for me as a writer, and my purpose is always to show that regardless of whether it is the happy ending, there's common grace. There are things that happen in people's lives that are good, whether they recognize them or not, and to always look for that, because I don't ever want to leave a reader with no hope. I don't think that's the truth. I think there's always hope. And so even though the Trials of Nellie Belle doesn't have a spectacularly happy ending, it has a hopeful ending.
Nice. Oh, I like that a lot. Now, one last question. This is so fun. We can just keep, talking all night, but well, your morning, my night. But trying to be, always cognizant of how much time we're spending from a listener's perspective. So one other thing that you mentioned early on that I'd like you to touch on briefly is the difference between things that you can say about somebody who has already died and somebody who hasn't yet, and where is that line? Like if somebody died last year and you start writing the story now, can you still include anything you want about that person? I imagine that some of those decisions would depend on where you live, and listeners to the podcast live in many countries all over the world, so I'm sure that's even more different depending on what country you live in, what you can say about whom. But from the standpoint of, it sounds like you write with compassion. So from a compassionate standpoint, what were the ways that you decided on who you would or wouldn't include, or what, since you're going for truth, but you don't want to make somebody look like an absolute horrible person with no redeeming qualities, like where are you on that?
Okay, first of all, I don't think you can say anything that you want, even if they aren't living. I think that you have to be true to who they were, and I'm not a legal expert, so I don't want to say what's legal and what isn't, but I'll give you an example. I had characters who I knew were in Hollywood at the same time that Leon was, and I read, and I knew that they moved to a commune that Leon moved to, that they would have been there at the same time. I knew those things. Did they ever actually meet and interact? I don't know. But I wrote it that way, where they had met and they interacted. And I did research on those people. The commune was called, it was an artist commune called the Dunes, and it was in Oceano, California. And there is a community there that has a lot of books that were written about that period of time. It was in the 30s, I believe, and about those people. In fact, one of them that I used wrote a book. So I used incidents. It's not plagiarism because I didn't use her words, but I used incidents that I knew were. She, in her book, talked about her mom and their mom's mental illness. So I felt like I could touch on that, show it. I don't have to name it, but I could show it. And it's true. I don't need a diagnosis. I don't need permission. Although I did think that the daughter who is in the book as a child, I thought she was still alive, and I did write to her and say, I want to do this. Do I have your permission? I got a note back from her grandson who said she'd passed, and he wanted to see the way I had portrayed his grandmother. And so I sent it to him, and he said, oh, that's great. I love it.
Oh, nice.
So I would just say, be careful, be thoughtful. I will say, I honestly don't know where that line is. And so some of this I'm taking on faith that my heart is in, and I'm not suggesting that anybody else do this. But another example was I had a senator give a speech. Now, that is a real senator. It was in the time frame in which, and I used facts that I knew about him as the context for his speech. Did he give it in that time on that day? I don't know.
Yeah.
He could have.
Yeah.
I know a lot of that way. If a person is famous, there are a lot of books being done now where you have somebody show up as a character.
Right.
And
in fact, yeah, I was just going to say, one of our guests, I think it was Christy Phillips, told me, or I think she said it on the interview, that there was a moment when in this particular area of the West during, 1867 or whatever year it was, she knew that Mark Twain had been to that town, and he had either been the year before or the year after, and she just rearranged things and made it work so that he was there then, so that she could use the things that actually happened when he had come to that town as part of just sort of a background story bit that had happened. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, because it's not taking anything it's not making a lie out of anything. It's
No,
just kind of
no.
moving things around a little bit in sort of the background of the story.
Right, right. Yes.
Nice.
I would just say tread carefully.
Yeah. And I was, I should have been more clear because I was really thinking more about your family members. Was there anybody that said, I don't want you to mention, you know, my mother, like a cousin who said, I don't want you to mention, you know, my father? Or...
Nope.
Oh.
Fortunately, I have a very small family.
Yeah. Despite your, let's see what it be, great grandfather having
10 brothers, yes. Yes, yes. And yeah, I suppose there's always one of them who could have, you know, who could say, no, he wasn't there at that time. Yeah. I'm not anticipating that's going to happen. Yeah. These are not famous people we're dealing with. And again, the reason I used their names was just to keep that record for my family.
Yeah. Oh, which is really kind of beautiful, you know. Now you're making me think. There's this one story my grandpa would tell, and the more the older he got, and the more his mind started, you know, losing its strength. He would tell this one story over and over and over again. And honestly, it was about the time that he realized it was time to go home and marry my grandma. So, I mean, it's wonderful that that's the one story that stayed with him, you know, despite, you know, the changes to his mind over time and stuff. And he would tell it over and over and over again, you know, and as kids, we're like rolling our eyes. Oh, Grandpa, you told us this story 100 times. But I am so glad because I know that story now. And now you're making me think, oh, I wonder how I could use that story somewhere.
That's what I want to do. That's the one thing that I hope is that people will think about telling their family stories and writing them down, because when you're gone, who's going to be there to tell that story? And maybe the world won't read it, but maybe your family will, and it's ways of passing these things down. And maybe also, I mean, we realize, having sat around the family table, stories are stories. And they're not, they change over time. They get presented from the point of view of the family member that is telling it, but it's still a story. It's in the same way that when I put a novel out, I put a story out, people are going to read it with their frame of reference, and they're going to see different things in it. And I actually love it when a reader will tell me something they saw in the story. I have a friend of mine who said, this is a story about suffragette. And I thought, no. But if that's what you saw, if that's what really spoke to you, then that's legitimate. Yeah. That's legitimate.
Oh, wow. This is so interesting. And I'm sure that there are people thinking to themselves right now, you know what? Now you're giving me ideas about something that I could do that maybe I hadn't thought about doing, or I've been wondering how I would do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Use a family story in a novel. Even in nonfiction, you can work those stories in. And because by nature, we are all storytellers.
That's so true.
Why shouldn't more people get in on this fun?
That's right. Oh, I love it. And I would love to hear you just reiterate one more time for anybody who wants to tell a story that it's okay to want to write and tell stories and maybe share it with your friends or no one. It doesn't have to be only for publication.
Right, and I'm sure you've heard this too. Writing a good story, a good book, and publishing a book are two completely different processes. Yeah. And it's perfectly, you are a writer if you are writing. And you're a storyteller. I guess you're an author if you publish, but you know, and even if you're writing just for yourself, or you're writing to share in a group, or you're writing to put together a book to give your family members. Yeah. Those are things that are cherished.
Yeah. You know, and once in a while, something unexpected happens and you write a story and you give it to your family and then some friends and then some more friends, and you end up having this big book that becomes a movie called The Shack.
Yes, exactly.
Like, what?
Exactly. Yes, yes, yes. It takes on a life of its own. And stories do. They do. But sometimes the story's getting told and people forget where they heard it.
Right. I was talking with a girlfriend of mine who is also a writer, and I specifically remember we were sitting on this beautiful little kind of fountain edge at a library somewhere in Phoenix. I want to say it might have been a Mesa library, or maybe a library in Chandler, and and we were talking about stories and what books we had just been reading and whatever, and I don't know how we got on this conversation, but then I was like, oh, you know what, but I read about this woman who blah blah blah, and I told her this whole thing about this newspaper article that I had read about this woman, blah blah blah, and all these things happened. And then I was like, where did I read that? Doggone it, where did I? And then I just stopped and I started laughing so hard I almost fell into the fountain. And I said, oh my gosh, Lisa, that isn't a newspaper story. That's a book called Remembrance by Jude Devereaux.
Yes.
Good stories. They stay with you.
Yes, they do. Yes, sometimes they become your own.
That's right.
So you mentioned Arizona writer, the RWA, Romance Writers of America, very active there.
Yes.
They have a wonderful conference in Scottsdale every year for, if anybody is in that area, Scottsdale Library, you can pick up lots of tips.
Yes.
You probably were aware of them when you were there.
Desert Rose chapter, my very first chapter.
Yes. I've been to their seminars, and they're wonderful.
They are, yeah. If anybody's listening from that area, or if you live anywhere in the general Southwest of the United States, that conference is known to be a very good one.
Yes.
So I encourage people.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, listen, any last tips? And also, where can listeners find you and your books?
Well, I think I probably tipped out here.
Yeah, you gave us a lot of tips.
Thanks. Well, and feel free to, visit my website, sydneyavey.com. I do a newsletter. I'm doing it quarterly right now, in which I share tips with readers. It's called For Readers, for Writers. And I share tips for readers and tips for writers. And so if you sign up for that, or sign up for my blog, reach out to me through media. I've got all my links to Facebook, and I don't Twitter much, but I am on Twitter. But Facebook, do that, and you can, through my website, you can send me questions, which I would love to answer. I'd love to talk about it and show the book.
Oh, it's a beautiful cover.
Thank you. Anyway, yes, SYDNEYAVEY.com.
Excellent. Sydney, thank you so much. This has been really interesting, and I think it's going to have tidbits that will be useful to any writer, especially when we started talking about just use some of your family's stories. But this is going to be great for somebody who really has had this idea and didn't know exactly how to do it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this.